3 of John K. Lundwall, Astrotheology. See description to help support our show.
That's what they thought the stars and constellations were. And there was a esoteric system where the name of a certain constellation would have several puns attached to it, homophones, words that sound the same, spelled differently, etc. And it's through those puns that you could create associations that might prognosticate what was going to happen in the battle. But for the sake of John McHugh's thesis, he asserts that through the punning of Mesopotamian constellation writing, we get all the motifs of the story in the New Testament, Jesus walking on water.
Now, John,
yeah.
The stars as a form of writing.
Yeah.
Did civilizations come to recognize that after they had already developed writing, or were the stars considered to do that sort of thing before actual writing had been introduced to those societies?
I would argue it's after writing is invented. Writing's invented, and suddenly the stars are seen in a new way.
Right.
They're seen as writing, and so no one really understands the birth of astrology. By the way, we don't know when it happened. I would argue it happens after the invention of writing. Astrology is a product of the invention of writing. It's because now you're categorizing things in a completely different way. Oral peoples observe everything in nature, and they look at all the relationships in nature, and that's how they determine where your watering hole is, and when the calendar occurs. All the cyclical events. They're watching everything in nature. Literate people don't do that anymore. We read symbols on a page, and the symbols on the page, the early alphabets, the symbols on the page were actually still objects in nature. You had animals that were hieroglyphs, and you had, it was still related to how they processed information. But over time, the alphabetic characters get disassociated with that, and they just become symbols. And now you're reading something on a page that has no corollary in the natural world. This actually rewires the brain. Now we are all internalized thinkers because we're reading things that have no corollary in the outside world. Oral thinkers, they don't internalize like we do. They, remember a circle. They don't have a word for circle. They call it a plate or a moon. They don't have a word for square. They call it a door or a house, right? So they're very concrete thinkers, and everything they think is attached to something they look at and see. Well, literate people, we don't do that anymore. We abstract everything because we process our information with abstract symbols on a page that have no corollaries in nature. So this is just the subtext of how we the medium is the message, guys. And so the invention of writing reformats the way people look at their cosmology. And so not only do we get the birth of the city-state, I would argue that's probably when we get the birth of our first astrological models. Now, before that, they're still using astronomy, and they're still using heaven-earth correspondences. But, by the early second millennium BCE, there is a deeply systematized astrological system throughout all the ancient world. And that is a product of that regimented priestly caste of scribes who are writing, and they're saying, hey, now we can do this to the sky. This is the secret of the gods, and we're going to relay the writing of the gods. We've been doing this for generations anyway, but now we've discovered the secret. We now understand that this is writing that can be used to foretell the future, for example. And so I think that's how that develops. But look, ancient astrology, guys, isn't the modern newspaper natal astrology. You look up your birth chart and it's going to tell you what's going to happen to you today. Ancient astrology, its primary purpose was to manage the state. We've just completely forgotten that all their intellectual resources was to make the state run as a copy of the cosmos. And so, you did your rituals in in repetition of cosmic cycles, because what you're doing is you're bringing down the beneficial powers of the eternal into the material realm. And so you are trying to duplicate cosmic patterns in all your social structures. And this just gets a new iteration with the birth of astrology, where they are trying to do all their wars, the contracts, their treaties in line with what the stars tell them would be the best time to do it, because they're modeling the earthly order after the heavenly order. The primary purpose of astrology is to manage the state. And that's just something we've forgotten. I could go off on another tangent. I really want to, but I'll just get in trouble with. I'm already in trouble with some of the scholars I know. What, he's talking about astrotheology? Off with his head. And so I won't get into how the modern world, we've descended back into these astrological. Astrology is ontology. It defines the self, the state, in connection with our ideas of the eternal. So technically, no, it's not modern science. Modern science is an ontology. It's there to produce technology. But we keep relapsing into these social models that we attach our sciences to, and there is a great argument to make that whatever you think of climate change, the climate change industry is basically the secular way to manage the state. And they use every weather event to describe their theory. And this is very much how the astrologers used every stellar action to describe their theory. And we're actually doing the exact same thing that they did thousands of years ago. We've just transposed it from the sky to the ground. And, I am a huge environmentalist, so let me just put that out there. But I think we have some real problems with the way the system is being run, because it's more ontology than it is science, and it makes me very nervous. Anyway,
right.
You can edit that out if you want. I'm ready to talk about the New Testament and astrotheology. Look, so McHugh writes this article, and I just flatly disagree with his methodology. And so I wrote a opposing article. My article was called "The Heavenly Shepherd Approaches to a Resurrection Story." And I basically say this whole Mesopotamian constellation writing that you're using to prove that this is where they got the motifs in the New Testament story, I think it is highly implausible. And so we don't have any corollaries that we know of in any of the record where these ancient astrologers were doing what you're saying that they are doing. Two, you're using this constellation writing to every Mesopotamian word had a couple dozen puns associated with it, right? And so if you combine a couple words with the mix of puns that could be associated with it, you start getting thousands of possibilities. And so using McHugh's methodology, you could say, oh yeah, Mesopotamian constellation writing was what the writers of the Star Wars script used to create their story. If you could literally make that argument. And so it's just not refined enough to, so I just had a huge problem with his methodology. But having said that, I did think, now, he does have an interesting thesis, because there are a lot of similarities between these ancient pagan systems of Orion and the Sea Walk, which is associated with resurrection or new life, and the gospel story of Jesus. But just because there's associations doesn't mean anything. It just means there's associations. So I wrote in my own article, I just explored that theme to see, what could we prove, what couldn't we prove, and what could we say about it. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to talk about, the contours of my argument in my article. And so here we have the scene in the Gospels of Jesus walking on water. It's reported in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, John. There are the references. What's really interesting is that every Gospel writer gives a different story. And of course, I suppose you would expect that, but it's also really interesting that most modern Protestant Christians, anyway, we're not very good at looking at the contradictions in the text. What tends to happen is believers just combine all the differences into a meta narrative, and they create a meta gospel, right? Matthew remembers this, Mark remembers this, John remembers this. Therefore, the truth must be all of it. And so we'll just homogenize it all and create this narrative where Jesus does all these things. I don't think that's very smart methodology. I think it's much more enlightening to look at the contradictions as contradictions, and to see what we can learn, what the differences are. And of course, you can homogenize them if you want, but yeah.
Hey, John, if you need to do chapter and verse, I've got the scriptures electronically in front of me. So if you need me to render or to read any of them, let me know.
All right.
So you can actually point out
I'm going to fly through these because I just spent so much time talking about Cain and Abel and climate change, which has nothing to do with anything. So I'm going to fly through this. But
well, I didn't want anybody to miss anything because we didn't deal with the actual text. So it's up to you, however you want to do it.
All right. Well, I just wanted to point out that the differences in these texts, in the story of Matthew, Jesus departs to pray. The disciples are in the boat. A storm comes. They call to Jesus. He walks on water. Peter briefly walks on the water. In the Gospel of Mark, something else happens. It's a little bit humorous. Jesus tries to walk by the floundering disciples. What's that about? They're about to die in a storm, and they see Jesus, and he's sneaking on by, and they call to him and say, "Hey, save us!" And Jesus looks over and said, "Oh, okay, I'll save you." And then in the book of John, something else happens. He walks on water. He saves the disciples, but he saves the disciples by transporting their boat instantly to the other side of the shore. No, wait a second. What? That's a miracle greater than walking on water. He just zipped out a TARDIS out of nowhere and moved the boat instantaneously across the sea.
Thank you, Doctor Who.
Yeah, that's right. And so we get these radical differences in the Gospels. They all have similarities, but so we look at those differences and we see, well, these might be different narrative threads from different traditions that they're homogenizing into their textual constructs. So, all right. So the first thing I did as a scholar is I went to the library to look up what the biblical scholars have said about the Jesus walking on water narrative. And so there's this great book by Patrick Madden where he goes through all the modern scholarship, or the scholarship of the 20th century anyway, and he divides how biblical scholars have interpreted this narrative motif, Jesus walking on water, into 5 different categories. And I thought I would show these guys because one of the big criticisms that mainstream biblical scholars have against astrotheology is that it's just too subjective. And they're right. There are a lot of people say this is astrotheological. It relates to this constellation, but suddenly everyone's giving a different interpretation. The interpretation is so subjective. There's no rigid uniform standard by which to interpret the astronomical motif, that it becomes very unreliable as a methodology. And so Bible scholars just reject it out of hand. And you know what? There's truth to that. These astrotheological systems were never literate. They were never written down. If you publish, you perish. And they were always ritualized. They were secret initiations. And so we're not going to get what literate biblical scholars want.
Say that last part one more time. Just say that one more time. I love that.
I'm just saying the astrotheological models were not literate. They were associated with secret rituals and initiations. If you publish, you perish. And therefore, to get the kind of literate proof that literate biblical scholars want, They're demanding a diamond out of a turnip. You just aren't going to get the written proof from these ancient oral rituals structures. I mean, this is, I mean, you know, I'm not going to get into that. The bottom line is there is a lot of subjectivity in astrotheological interpretation. Fine and well. Look at what the mainstream biblical scholars have done with just mainstream literate biblical interpretation of this story. Madden divides biblical interpretation into 5 different categories. He says there's scholars who believe the account is historical. It happened just as the text tells us it happened. You know, some of them, most of them don't deal with all the differences. You know, they homogenize the differences in those accounts. And then there's a group of scholars that say, well, maybe or maybe not it's historical. We don't know. And then there's a group of scholars that say, oh, no, it's historical, but he didn't walk on water. He was walking on a sandbar. You know, there's some natural event because we can't believe in the supernatural. And then there's the scholars who say, oh, it's not historical at all. In fact, it might even descend from foreign sources. In the first half of the 20th century, there's a whole group of scholars that compared Jesus walking on water to the Buddha narrative, who walks on water and helps his disciples. And so, you know, there's a group of scholars that say it descends from pagan origins. This was John McHugh's thesis. And then there's a final group of scholars that say, well, the account is a displaced resurrection narrative. That's actually very interesting. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I list all this because, all right, so one of the main arguments against astrotheology is it's too subjective. Now look at what mainstream Bible scholars do with the interpretation of any story in the Bible. It's like throwing a dart at a dartboard, except the dartboard is any damn well thing you want to believe. I mean, it's historical, it's not historical. Maybe it's historical, it happened, it's miraculous, it's not miraculous. It's you know, look, Bible scholarship runs the whole gamut, right? And so it's as subjective as anything else. You know, and that's just good to know. I still believe in scholarly methodology, and so I am still going to tackle biblical issues using scholarly methodology. But, you know, here's another aspect of scholarly methodology that we should be aware of. It cannot address the divine. It cannot address the supernatural. It can't. There's nothing in scholarly methodology that can prove or disprove anybody walking on water. It's just outside. Right. It's just outside of its purview. So that's a real challenge, because if you're a scholar studying, you know, the supernatural aspects of religion, you've got a real problem, because, you know, your methodology can't address that. So, you know, so is Jesus historical, and did he really overcome death? You know what? There's no scholarly methodology that can tell you. That is a choice you have to make, and it's a choice of faith. It's a leap of faith. That's all you get. And so there's nothing that you're going to find in the archaeological record that's going to prove it or disprove it. And, you know, this is, you know, one of the weaknesses. You know, the mythicists say there's no evidence for a historical Jesus. Well, whatever evidence there is, we've got it. Right? What kind of evidence are you going to find that would prove to you that Jesus is historical? Let's say you found a birth record and it said, on this date, you know, 6 BC, 6 AD, whatever, Jesus was born to Joseph and Mary from Nazareth, and a donkey and a sheep were by his stable. Let's say you found that birth record. What would scholars do? They would immediately say it's a fraud, right? I mean, we take evidence and we process it through our own, our own cultural lenses and our own prejudices. If you ever sit in a courtroom, you can see two lawyers arguing over the same evidence from completely different points of view, and you quickly learn, oh my gosh, any evidence can be argued in almost any way. So the bottom line, guys, is that the scholarly methodology can't address the divine. So there's that. So, and I believe in scholarly methodology, but in the interest of full disclosure, I am also a man of faith, and I just have to take a leap of faith to be a man of faith. My scholarship isn't going to prove or disprove the things I want to prove or disprove because I can't. So that's what we get. And the other thing is, I've been around scholars long enough to know that if you were to transport 100 modern day scholars back in time and in a TARDIS, and you transported them right in front of Jesus, right at the moment that he's raising Lazarus from the dead, so that they could see this happen for themselves. I'm just telling you what human nature would do. What would happen? 100 scholars, they see Jesus, and he's actually raising Lazarus from the dead. What would happen? Well,
90% of
scholars, a few scholars would probably fall on their knees and say, I believe. And I'm not even going back to my own time in the TARDIS. I'm going to stay here and become a disciple of Jesus. A few people would do that. A few others would go, yeah, I do believe, but I'm going to start my own school and charge tuition because you got to make money somehow, right? And so they start their own religion, right? A few scholars would do that. But I'm telling you, the majority of scholars, this is what they would do. They'd pick up a club and they'd beat poor Lazarus back to death. They'd throw his corpse back into the tomb and they'd turn to Jesus and they'd say, that never happened. I speak with a little hyperbole, but I'm sorry that, that's just sort of the deal. We're in our own conceptual universes. And so we go to this material with our own conceptual interpretations of what we accept as evidence and not evidence. And look here in front of your screen, all the different scholarly interpretations of the Jesus walking on water motif. And it's everything you can conceive. And so,
John,
yes.
you brought back memories of grad school.
Well,
When you're.
I'm just describing grad school.
Yeah, that's all you're doing. When you finally decide after months of looking at the literature, what your PhD thesis, what your dissertation is going to be about, and then you find out that some scholar has already done that study.
Yeah.
And then you hide it in a corner of the library, hoping that nobody will discover it. Okay. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Edit that out, Derek. Edit that out.
That's right.
Right.
Hey, Derek, there's a lot you got to edit out of tonight's show. Thank goodness. You can edit. I'll let you edit anything you want. Put in a picture of a cat somewhere. All right. The point, I'm just making some points that scholarship is a reliable methodology, but it has its own limitations. And so when we're talking about the divine, we're talking about the supernatural, we're talking about life after death, overcoming death, scholarship has really nothing to say about that. And so you just have to make your own choices. So make them. And if you are an atheist and that's the choice you make, then hopefully that choice helps you lead a good life. And if it does, then I'll support your choice. And if you're a believer and you say, well, I can't prove it, but I'm going to believe that Jesus walked on water, I don't care. Good for you. If it helps you become a good person, do it, right? The important thing is we're not killing each other with a rock because that's our nature. And so, anyway, so there's that. Well, let me just go back. What really piqued my interest in reading this scholar's review of all the scholarly interpretations is this last one. Madden actually belongs to this camp. He believes that the story of Jesus walking on water is a displaced resurrection narrative. And he gives reasons why, he believes this, and here are essentially his reasons. If you look at all the stories in the Gospels about Jesus walking on water, and you compare that to when Jesus first appears to the disciples, this isn't to Mary or the women at the tomb, but to the disciples, strangely enough, Jesus appears to the disciples by the sea. In John 21:1, I should have wrote it down. The exact Greek phrase can be interpreted as by the sea or on the sea. And that exact same phrase is used in all the sea walk narratives in all three Gospels. But also the similarities are these. The disciples are bereft of the Lord, darkness followed by the appearance of the Lord. The appearance of the Lord occurs at or right before dawn, a formal greeting, including command not to fear the Lord, difficulty recognizing the Lord. In other words, there's these common motifs between the sea walk narrative and Jesus first appearing to the disciples. And so Madden and a group of scholars say, what we think happened is you had this resurrection narrative, but it got split up. And so now you get this one scene of Jesus walking on the sea, saving the disciples. But originally it was Jesus walking on the sea, saving the disciples over death. Right. And so,
John, by the way, yes, John 21:1 talks about him walking upon, the Greek word is epi, right?
Yes,
upon the sea.
Thalases, I think.
Yes, yes, sir.
So right, epi, upon the sea. So I think that is a very sophisticated argument. That's a scholarly argument. And so I think it, but what's really interesting about that argument is, if you listen to the last podcast, did you guys listen to the last podcast we did together?
Yes.
I hope so, because you were.
Oh yeah.
In my last podcast, I proposed the theory. It's a theory and it's unprovable, but I proposed the theory that by the second millennium BCE, the flood story was being used as part of an initiation process to overcome death. This is why Gilgamesh asks Utnapishtim, how do I gain eternal life? And this is why Utnapishtim gives his answer as the flood story. And I went, and what's interesting, I traced this through my book, Mythos and Cosmos. There are numerous traditions in the mythological record which associates the floods with new birth, resurrection, and eternal life. And the big one is, chapter 175 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But we also have the labors of Heracles and the story of Rama, where they find the secrets of life using a bow and arrow and confronting the flood waters or the sea waters with it. And so we get these multiple motifs that have all the same structure to them. And so the idea then is that in the oral age with the oral imprinting press, the ritual of overcoming death was synthesized in your oral imprinting press. You associated it with a certain star that represented rebirth, and we can actually track that star. It's probably Sirius, maybe Canopus. I'll explain why later. And then you reenacted a myth that you told associated with that star. We forget that this is very often during childbirth, for example, in multiple different cultures, there's a ritual that would be performed as the woman gives birth. And part of that ritual would include a deity that is the creation deity. And the reason why they're including the creation deity in the birth ritual is because the creator created the earth. And so they're analogically using the powers of the creator deity and imposing that on the birth of a new child. So when you perform that ritual, the child will be born as a new creation. So what they're doing is they're pulling in your creation myth and your creation ritual, and they're transposing it on to the myth and ritual of childbirth, right? That's what they're doing. I'm arguing they did that with the flood story. They pulled in a deity of the flood, a ritual, a narrative of the flood, and they transposed it over to the ritual of life after death, gaining life, because if you survive the flood, you're going to survive the waters of death, right? So that's the thinking behind it. And my argument then goes, this eventually turns into baptism. This eventually turns into our liturgy of baptism. We get reborn as a new Christian or whatever religion you are out of the waters, right? And so it's just interesting that this particular scholarly interpretation says Jesus walking on water is associated with resurrection. Well, it turns out all the pagan deities of resurrection are associated with waters. And not only that, they have to cross the waters. In no small sense, they walk upon the waters, right? And so here we have our next slide. Look, the ancient resurrection theme are gods or heroes who are born or reborn from the sea, or who must cross the sea to find rebirth. Well, here they are: Dionysus, Gilgamesh, Sargon, Osiris, Noah, Moses, Cyrus, Tammuz, Karna, Oedipus, Adonis, Heracles, Jason, Perseus, Orion, Romulus. All those people have to cross the waters in order to get rebirth or to get resurrected. And literally, Orion walks on the waters to get rebirth and resurrected. This is why John McHugh says Orion is the precursor to the Jesus story, because it's the constellation that walks on the waters and where he finds rebirth. But there's another really interesting parallel in Diodorus's Library of History, where he talks about Orpheus. Orpheus is leading Jason and the Argonauts to the underworld, where where they find the secrets of life. Okay, so this is our repeated theme, and they're crossing a sea. They're Argonauts in a boat crossing a sea to find the secrets of life. All right, so here's our mythological template. Orpheus is the leader. He's the guide, because he's been initiated into the mysteries of the Cabaroys. And I'll talk about that in a second. But according to Diodorus, when they are in their boat, a great storm comes up, and the boat of the disciples of Jason is about to be overcome. They're about to be drowned. And so what's Orpheus do? He prays to Castor and Pollux, and the storm is abated. And then they're able to continue their journey to find the secrets of life. Well, this is also, there's a lot of differences, similarities. We have a boat of disciples being led by Orpheus. Is a savior figure. He's a mystery cult figure of resurrection. Here's your parallel to Jesus. And he saves the boat from being overthrown by a storm. And of course, he doesn't walk on the waters, but you do have to cross the waters to get reborn. And more interestingly, he prays to Castor and Pollux. And this gets us into our astrotheology with Orion. So we're about to go down a rabbit hole, guys.
I like it.
Because one of the things I have a problem with astrotheologers is I think they get it all wrong. Look, astrotheology, because it's not mainstream scholarship, it's done by a lot of pseudo scholars, and so it's really problematic at best. But also, astrotheologers tend to say, "Hey, look, so Orpheus does the same thing as Jesus. Orpheus doesn't walk on the waters, but he does descend through the waters, and he does calm the storm, and he does save the disciples in the boat." And so, the Jesus story, therefore, is just a mimic of Orpheus. And then when they get into astrotheology, which I'm going to get into here real quick with some graphics, they'll say, well, the stars were in this position, and it's basically just the calendar. This is what happened to them. And so they told a story about that, and that's what turns into our story of Jesus walking on waters. This is generally how it's told, that all astrotheology is just some sort of simple calendar model of the stars crossing the sky at a certain season, and it gets turned into a story. That's not what is going on at all. And I take you back
quick,
to that.
John, real quick, if you don't mind me emphasizing that, what you're saying. Are you suggesting not only does it portray these things, but there's levels to this, or there's more to it than just, oh, well, that does tell time. I mean, when these constellations come, this season comes, there's more than just the physical aspect of telling time in astrotheology. This is esoteric. This is in every aspect back to the orality concept where it encompasses everything. Would you agree with that's where you're headed with it?
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. We are dealing with a vast metaphysical system. I mean, it's a religious system. And even as scholars can't address the divine, we can't really address what the ancient astrologers they were describing the same supernatural processes of overcoming death, but using different metaphors. But it belonged to a very sophisticated metaphysic that only the surface was about calendric models of how the stars moved across the sky and the seasons. And that's where all the astrotheologists stop. And they say, oh, all your sacred stories, it's just based off this. No, actually, what they're basing it off is the same sacred story with the same deep metaphysics, just using a different metaphor. And so you've just shortchanged your argument, you astrotheologists, because you haven't answered the issue at all. So I'm going to get into this. And so let me just get into it. So I'm just showing you a graphic here. This is what I wrote in my response to McHugh. I said, look, rather than dealing with this improvable Mesopotamian constellation writing, which I think is deeply flawed, why don't we just do this? If Orion is I suppose it's important to note that the story of Orion, he gets stung on the foot by a scorpion, he dies. In another version, he's blinded. He rapes the daughter of a king, and he's blinded and punished, and he's exiled. In both stories, he has to cross the sea. He regains his sight in one of the traditions at the house of the sun, where he is reborn, and then he's cast as a constellation in the sky. That's sort of the mythological story of Orion. What we get are the motifs there, then, is the image of death, being stung by a scorpion. There's that scorpion again. And in the Mithras Heteroctony scene, the scorpion is below the bull, but it turns out Scorpio was a gate of death. Remember Heraclides writing that there were 3 paths of the soul in the afterlife. One was near Scorpio. That was the gate of death, where one descended into the underworld. When Gilgamesh descends into the underworld, he passes a scorpion gate, guarded by scorpion men. It's the same gate in the sky. And so this motif of Orion being stung on the foot by a scorpion is astronomical, sure enough. But it's dealing with a metaphysics of rebirth that lost track of. So, but in any case, Orion is a good constator over death by the waters, and I'll tell you why. First off, here's our calendar model. Let me follow picturing the way. It's produced by Starry Night software, which allows me to pick the location on the earth and the time. So here's the Sea of Galilee at the time of Jesus. This is the sky you would see, okay? And this is the fall months, where Orion on the right there is setting in the east. The constellation of the Argo, or ship, is seen sailing on waters as Orion set. Orion is literally walking on the waters as the boat makes its passage across the horizon. So it's just an interesting coincidence that if you were to stand on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, you would see in the fall stormy months Orion walking on the water with a boat sailing behind him, right? And Orion is a good archetype for the Savior figure, Jesus. And I'm going to get into that. Anciently, Orion was related to stormy waters. Virgil, Horace, Pliny, Polybios all refer to Orion with stormy epithets. This is due to the fact that in the fall months, Orion was seen setting in the west as the sun rose in the east. The fourth night of the watch was the time right before dawn when Jesus walks on the water. But it's also the time when Orion is seen descending from the sky to drown below the horizon right before dawn during the stormy season. So it turns out fourth night of the watch, which is a really interesting detail the gospel writers include. Why would you say that Jesus walks on the water at the fourth night of the watch? It seems like a superfluous detail. But it just so happens that at the fourth night of the watch, Orion walks on the water with the boat Argo behind him during the stormy season when the storm overthrows the boat. That's an interesting coincidence. Coincidentally, if standing on the shore of Galilee, they would also see the ship Argo upon the waters. Well, furthermore, the motif of the boat of the disciples speeding to the other side of the shore, that's the Gospel of John, that's what he gives us, just might be explained by the fact that Orion appears with the sun for most of the year, but quickly descends from the sky during the fall months. By winter solstice, this constellation has disappeared with the rising sun. So summer and fall, Orion sets as the sun rises. But by winter solstice, the sun is setting and Orion rises in the west. In other words, Orion has transposed himself on the other side of the shore from the sun. Are you getting that? So here's a picture of that, where in the winter solstice, the sun on the right is setting, and that is when Orion rises to walk on the waters. And so Orion rises in the east as the sun sets in the west. Orion is disassociated from the rising sun, is now seen with the setting sun. This disconnect from the rising sun explains many of the motifs in the ancient myths, including his rebirth cycle, in association with resurrection in different religious traditions. In other words, the rising sun is when he sets. The setting sun is when he rises. He gets disassociated from the solar cycle, only to be reassociated with the rising sun. And so it's seen as a motif of resurrection. Are you following that?
Yes, John, you have me wanting to ask a vital question. And yes, it is controversial. And, I know you've made it clear you are a man of faith and so forth. So this is a question I think, and this is just my journey. Everybody's on a journey, right? And in my journey, I feel as if, let's suppose hypothetically, that what we've been told by the church, that one must believe a man physically died and physically rose biologically from the dead, including Lazarus, etc., etc., etc. Okay, let's suppose that what we're talking about here astrologically and the resurrection that we're seeing taking place, this rebirth concept that we know is mythology, all right, we know it is of deep, deep esoteric and personal significance to every person in not only the writers of this text, but the context of the people that it was being spoken to. And it look at what it's done through history. Even though we've maybe interpreted things in so many ways, there is a structure, there's a deep wisdom to the text, no matter what you do on the onslaught of these, literal interpretations of certain things. Is it possible that this resurrection concept with Jesus could very well be what we're talking about here in an oral type of sense, yet it's ritualized, and it may not have actually been necessarily a literal guy who actually did those things? Not saying there wasn't a guy named Jesus. It could possibly have been. But he might have been a priest, like we've talked about, and he ritualized or had these motifs, these mythological motifs of wisdom incorporated into a story, which I know I'm rambling. I'm not trying to take over the show, but I'm just trying to make the point. What if, is this a possibility? And have you thought about that?
Well, look, guys, astrotheology is scripture for oral people. This is how they conceptualize their idea of the eternal and of rebirth and resurrection. They wed it to patterns in the sky because that's their imprinting press. So this is their scripture. And so, your question is, Jesus could have been a historical figure. I personally believe Jesus was historical. I find that the argument that of his non-historicity a little bit silly. But that doesn't mean that everything in the text happened historically. And what I think you're asking is, could these things just be ritualized traditions based off these old patterns that gets historicized in our text. Is that your question?
Yes, something like that. And that, just to emphasize, so I get a good answer, because I know I want to make sure I'm drilling this home. I'm not saying did Jesus exist or not. That's irrelevant. I'm actually on the fence. I'm not 100% sure either direction, but I'm fairly saying there's a likeliness that a guy named Jesus that is based in this text. That's a rabbit trail. My ultimate thing is, let's just say he does exist. This guy actually did exist. He was mythologized, or if you will, I hate to use that term, in your sense of orality concepts of what we're seeing with this ancient tradition being shown, do you think it's possible that a guy named Jesus actually didn't physically, literally die and rise from the dead, but they took these wisdom patterns and applied them to him? Is that a possible, explanation instead of the literal historical understanding?
Yeah, that is a possible explanation. Guys, why is a ritual explanation of an eternal truth going to be substantively different than a historical explanation? Remember, oral peoples consider truth as cosmic facts. Literate peoples consider truth as historical facts, right? So a ritualized expression of, couched in astrotheology is still getting at the same eternal concept as a historical explanation. And if you come in and say, it's not historical, therefore what you're believing isn't true, then you've missed the oral methodology altogether. Because what they're saying is, you can be resurrected. I don't care if Jesus lived and resurrected. I'm showing you in the sky, in the earth, in the patterns of nature, life dies and resurrects. It does it every seasonal cycle, and you are the culmination of the creation, and this will happen to you too. So I'm going to express this through myth, ritual. Myth and ritual, we express it through historical narrative. Why do we have to say that if it's not historical, it's not true?
I agree with you, man.
Look,
we don't.
Look, I can't answer for you, Derek, what's going to happen to you when you die. I just have my guesses. Purgatory for at least 3 centuries.
Yeah. Oh, well, you know what? I'm going to let my ancestors...
He got you there, Derek.
Hey, I'll meet you there.
Thanks.
I'll be at the bar, okay?
That is so wrong.
Yeah, right.
Look, I can't explain to you what no one can tell you what's going to happen when you die. But for thousands of years, for tens of thousands of years, there has been an existential decision, and it's a conscious choice of faith that most people believe that there is life after death. And it turns out in these astrotheological systems, they're not about calendar processes. Everything I just showed you on the screen with Orion being associated and disassociated with the sun, that's where astrotheologians leave it. And they say, oh, so this is what's actually being described, and therefore you and your belief of Jesus walking on water and him being a literal resurrecting savior, you're just believing this is all just fairy tale. And they're missing the point entirely. First off, they get the astrotheology wrong, which I'm going to continue to do. I was going to read you something out of my book, Mythos and Cosmos, which addresses your question, but it'll take me too long to look it up. Let me just say a couple of things. How about this? I mean, we're well beyond the 45 minutes I had. You're going to have to do all kinds of editing. I am so sorry. How are you even recording this? You got to have like a 6 terabyte drive to record this thing.
After 3,000 years in purgatory, I've acquired it.
The most radical.
Touche.
Yeah, that's right. Dude, I'm going to be there a lot longer than you. Let me just tell you. The most radical interpretation of the Bible, guys, the most radical interpretation happens to be the literal one. I mean, what if God actually showed up? Who would ever guessed that? I mean, seriously, what if God actually did appear on the mountain and speak to Moses? Who would know it? Scholars would know it. That's outside of the scholarly methodology. I mean, if Jesus was resurrected, the last people who would ever know are the scholars. All right. And so, again, this is a choice of faith that you have to make because you can't prove it.
But John,
yeah,
history scratches an itch.
Yeah,
it allows you to say, ah, and it doesn't really do much more than that, because somehow people think that something is real when it has an objective existence apart from them. And if it happened in history, it means it's not dependent on something as amorphous as a consciousness or thinking or some being, or it happened in a mind. Somehow it continues to exist and persist outside of, as I say, a conscious being. But really, I think what people are saying is it exists outside of me, that whether I'm here or not, no matter what I think or don't think, this thing has independent existence. And that just makes people feel good.
That's a very good
Would
insight.
you agree?
That's a very good insight, Luther. I do agree. History allows us to say, ah, it scratches. I think I'm going to take that from you.
Be my guest.
I think well, yeah, that is true. But, look, when it comes to the terrible questions, is there life after death? Is the soul eternal? What are you going to do with that? Science on such questions can only offer honest silence. Religion is going to tell you what you should believe about it, but the science is going to say you can't believe that. Well, I'm sorry, you get nothing but silence, Mr. Science. You have nothing to the scientific method to discuss it. So shut up. But then,
right.
And then you turn over here to the religious crowd and you say, all right, religious crowd, what are you going to do with this? Oh, wait, the high priest just killed his brother with a rock. Oh, crap. And so, look, these are existential questions. And so,
well, you bring up another good point, John. Like you've got the scientific side that can't answer it, and most of the time they answer it, even though they can't really answer these questions. And then
correct.
You have the opposite spectrum. You've got the highly religious structured systems who claim to have the absolute answers, okay? And they don't have the clue ultimately of knowing. They could say, look, we have experiences. We have certain things you can take from this. You can internalize and figure out and have somewhat of a know, or a gnosis, if you will, to some extent. You can experience it, but you have to carry our baggage, by the way. You have to believe a guy was somehow, with everything that comes with the indoctrination of the process, and whatever that traditional view may be. I mean, you could talk about whatever religious angle you want to take. You could talk about Muhammad and Quran, and, but I'm just making a point rather than just the Bible itself. You have one or the other. Can we ride the fence and say, look, I feel like there's a balanced understanding. There's things we'll never know. We live in the mystery, but we experience some things that we know to be true on an absolute level. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, I agree. That makes perfect sense, because that's what everyone does. I mean, look, no one ultimately knows for sure. The only people who know if there's life after death are the dead. And if you're talking to the dead, no one's going to believe you because you're crazy. and so and so there's just so you on the other hand, there are thousands of NDEs, near-death experiences, people who have died and have come back and they've had this numinous experience and they've reported it. And there's actually thousands of these in every culture, in every religious tradition. That's really interesting. I don't study them, but that's very interesting. All I can say on the subject is, have you had numinous experiences that don't correspond to any rational process? I have. I've had a couple experiences which are actually life-changing, and they're semi-mystical, and I can't explain them, but it does make me think. Wow, there's something more beyond material existence. So I'm going to pay attention to that. But all of this is a side argument, guys. It was G.K. Chesterton that said the self is further than any distant star. And that is a brilliant insight. The real challenge in conscious living is to discover who we are. And you know what? I don't know how many people actually do that. It's easier to belong to a religion and live a religion and never discover who you are. It's easier to become an atheist and make fun of religion and never discover who you are. Discovering who you are is finding the divine in yourself, because the more you become yourself, the more whole you become, the more holy you become. You discover God when you discover yourself, and vice versa. And So these are great metaphysical questions. They're completely off subject. But again, look, we live in the secular world that wants materialistic proof, and a lot of these religious issues, you're just not going to get that. And then we live in an era where we want historical proof, and it turns out, is Jesus historical? Well, we've got all the evidence we're ever going to get. And even if we found more evidence, it would be easily explained away. And so now you make your decision. Do you believe or do you not believe? And then you live with your decision. That's what you get. Religion, guys, is a tool. Like a gun, you can use a gun to feed and protect your family, and you can use a gun to destroy and kill. Well, religion has been used to feed and protect and ennoble and in grace, and it's been used to destroy and kill. And so if you got rid of all the churches and religions on the world, would we be a much more reasonable people? I'm going to tell you what the Bible says, and the Bible says no. And it says no because of that story of Cain and Abel. The curtain opens. Religion hasn't even been invented. And the first thing people do is hit each other over the head with a rock. You get rid of religion and nothing changes, people. And so human nature is human nature. And, the purpose of religion is to examine human nature and find out who you are. So, that is the most noble, difficult quest and journey anyone could ever take on, and it requires enormous work, suffering, and discipleship. And so it requires belief, that's for sure. So you make your decisions, and if your decisions help you become an ennobled, good person, I'm going to support you, and I don't care what you call your God. I don't care if you're an atheist. If you are doing good, all of Judaism is summarized in Micah 6. Hear thou, O man, what God requires of thee, to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk humbly before God.
Yes.
Well, that's my religion right there. If you're doing justice, if you're loving goodness and promoting goodness, and you're walking humbly before something you consider greater than yourself, you're going to be wise. You might be a goat herder, or you might be a professor. It doesn't matter, because it turns out most of the goat herders and most of the professors don't do that. So it's a very difficult road, a road filled with good and evil. So there's your sermon for the Sunday.
But that's good. Anyway. That's good.
This has really been amazing. That we took this to another level. I mean, this thing went from a little bit nervous.
Guys, I'm not even done with my astrotheology.
Well, look,
I have more slides. What are you doing?
He's got slides, Derek.
John, what are we doing here? Okay, so let me ask you this, guys. We're 3 hours into the 8 minutes.
Crap.
8 minutes. 8 minutes away from 3 hours into the program. Okay, I'm gonna definitely have to do some tweaking, but nonetheless, would you rather stop here and pick up where you left off, or because here I can already see what's going to happen, John. We found a connection tonight. We are in the zone. So what's going to happen is he's going to go through 3, 4, 5 more slides, and then he's going to be like, I have 1,700 more slides, man. Like,
yeah.
And Luther's going to be like, yeah, keep bringing them in, man. Keep bringing them in, bro. I'm good. And I'm over here going, guys, I got to get up at 5 in the morning.
I
love it. I love it.
More slides, but I think we're past 3 hours. I think we've gone on. I probably need to go.
Well, that's what I was going to say. If we chop it off here, man, we could pick up. I really think people need to come back and check this out because there's 3 hours here. I'll try to divide this into 3 separate clips, 3 1 hour clips, because it's meaty. There's very few people, just like you said, there's not many goat herders and there's not many people who are at the top who, follow that path. Well, it's very few people who will spend 3 hours going through this content. And if you're one of them, I'm very thankful for you. But we're going to go through the 1 hour at a time, separate these into parts. And look, get the book Mythos and Cosmos by Dr. John Lundwall. John K. Lundwall, because there are other Lundwalls, and you don't want to be mistaken. This is going to be... Oh, man, we found some magic tonight, did we not, guys?
I don't know if it's... I'm glad you think it's magic.
You are in rare form, not have been, but right now you're in rare form, and we get all of that with you. We got to have you back again. Although you answered just about every conceivable question I might have, and to boot, just a lot to think about. But Derek, what shall we do? We've got enough material for maybe 3 shows right now. So if we can gently kind of bring things to a close and ask John if he wants to make just some closing remarks right now, would that be okay?
Yeah, let's go ahead, John. Tell them how do they get your book? How do they check you out? Websites? Give them some information before we close this thing, brother.
Yeah. Again, I haven't. Do you see me? I turned off my screen share. I haven't created an online platform. I just have my Facebook page. You can get my book on Amazon, Kindle or print, Barnes and Noble, online. And so I am developing, guys. Here in another 6 months, I'll actually be able to say, hey, go to this website, and here I am, and here's all kinds of material you can look at. But that's down the road. So until then, people get me by looking at my YouTube channel and by watching a show like yours and by reading my book. And you know what? If they want to contact me, they can email me or message me. I actually had a couple people who watched your show last time contact me. So, and I'm totally okay with that. I'd be happy to answer any questions. They can message me through Facebook on my Mythos and Cosmos page, and then I'll message them back.
Luther, anything?
I'm not hearing Luther.
Yeah, thanks. My mute was still on. Sorry. But as long as people can get a hold of you, John, because you really have piqued not just the interest, but the soul's urgings in a lot of our listeners, I think. So we got to have you back.
I didn't even get down the rabbit hole of astrotheology. I was just showing you the surface, the calendric models. I wasn't even, I was about to get into why Orion is being used as a resurrection motif with water, why Orpheus is being used. That's a whole nother subject that the astrotheology is.
Yeah, but John, all roads lead eventually to the same point, man. And you got exactly where you were supposed to get on this particular show.
Oh, that's true.
And we can't thank you enough. We love you, John. We got to have you as often as you can make time for us. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we thank you for being a part of this moment. This is not just an academic exercise. Obviously, it's been taken to another level. And we've been led there by Dr. John Knight Lundwall. Thank you so much for sharing your time and talents with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision Podcast, MythVision Radio. Our PayPal and Patreon accounts are on your screen. Again, thanks to Ann Marathon for her question today, which was elaborately answered by Dr. Lundwall. And if you might have a question or comment you'd like to ask us, contact us at mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think about the podcast. Tell us who you'd like to see on the show, what topics you want to see us discuss. And please consider partnering with MythVision in bringing you the kind of programming that you enjoy.
Yes.
And that's about all I have.
Well, look, Luther, John, this was amazing. And look, if you're listening in, we have a Facebook group that we've called MythVision Podcast, and we have it under the old name with quotations, The Water Boys, which is John's specialty anyways. He loves water. I love that about you, man. Check us out. We also have a page. Get on there on Facebook. I just created it. It is MythVision Podcast. It's the page. So you can go on there and like. Eventually, I'm hoping, I got to learn more about it, but that'll be a way for us to plug some of our guests' books, their websites, their material, other than the group. And as Luther said, check the description out. We'll have the PayPal, the other areas if you're trying to help finance or help with financial areas on the show to try and get it off the ground. Our goal is to bring more guests of John's caliber and really just keep this thing going. I find these so edifying. And what you said earlier, Luther, history is like, and I felt lots of moments where I was like, but then John, you said something as well. The esoteric is like, wow. So you have the moments and then you have the wow, and we had both of those moments tonight. It's absolutely true. I mean, we have and wow, and you can't have one without the other sometimes. And this was not only a historical moment here on this show, but also a wow moment that I look forward to the next one. I think this is going to be great.
Well, if you want more people of my caliber on your show, may I suggest that you search the asylums, pubs, and purgatory.
I'm afraid that the mics might catch fire,
No, okay. Hey, guys, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, brother. Really, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John Knight Lundwall. Great. Good night.
MythVision Podcast. Till next one. All right, y'all. All right, so